from a high school student at Father Lacombe High School. I don't know where that is at all. I know it's in Calgary. And the email read this: Dear Holy Cross Church, I need some insight on some religious views. My question is this: they say that the captain goes down with the ship. So when the world ends, will God go down with it? And it seems to me that the question that she was asking was a question that probably has been asked by every faithful person throughout all the centuries. The question relates to the relationship between God and evil, God and suffering. The question is, how do we reconcile a perfect and all-loving and all-good God with our experiences of evil and suffering? And there are countless books that are written about this. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Problem of Pain. Philip Yancey wrote a book called Where is God When It Hurts? And in fact, if you type into Google God and suffering, you will come up with over 97 million sites, all with their own take on the matter. And in the Bible, probably the definitive book that talks about this is the book of Job. It's a book that struggles with God's presence in the plan in the midst of suffering and evil. For 37 chapters, Job sits in dust and ashes, and he cries and he yells at God in an attempt to have God answer him, to explain why calamity has come upon Job's life. That finally occurs in chapter 38. And in our reading, which is chapter 42, it's Job's reflection on God's answer. But interestingly enough, we don't find any great moral point at the end. There's no systematic reasoning for why evil and suffering makes sense. Job simply recognizes God's presence. And that's enough for him. And that's the final answer for him. I invite you to pick up your Bibles and turn to the book of Job. You may want to pick up your Bibles just so you can follow along in case you actually can't hear me. So you never know. Now, before we get into the reading, probably a little bit of recap is needed. If you're unfamiliar with the book of Job, Job is a righteous man, right? He's faithful and he's good, but he gets utterly decimated in life. His children die, his fortune is lost, his friends, they all desert him. He is left in physical suffering with boils all over his body. And his so-called friends that do remain keep telling him that this happens because God is angry with you, because you did something wrong, and God is getting back at you. And so for 37 chapters, Job yells and he screams at God. He asserts his own righteousness and he declares to God that he doesn't deserve anything that's happening to him. And he demands that God answers. And God finally does. But God's answer is not what you would expect, because God rarely does what we would expect. God asks a bunch of questions to Job. He asks, were you there when I laid the earth's foundations? Have you given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place? God asks, will the wild ox consent to serve you? Does the hawk take flight by your wisdom? See, everything that God asks Job is all about God's role as creator and redeemer and sustainer. What God is doing is he is describing how his continual presence in the midst of creation, how God holds all of creation in his hand, and how he cares for every part of it. God asks, do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Who cuts a path for the thunderstorms to water a land where nobody lives, to satisfy a desolate land? Now I ask you this: why would anybody care when a mountain goat gives birth? Somebody asked me, Kyle, do you care when mountain goats give birth? No, I don't care. I'm never going to see a mountain goat. It doesn't matter. They asked anybody there, do you care when it rains in the desert where nobody lives? No, not at all. Why would anybody pay attention to that? See, but that's the point. God does. God is so active in this world, and God loves this world so much that he is aware of every drop of rain that nobody else cares about. He watches with delight at the birth of every living thing. God not only creates, he sustains and he redeems. And with 3 chapters of those questions flying at Job, Job gets the point. It says, then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No plan of yours can be thwarted. Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Now, importantly, Job isn't acknowledging that his suffering was some part of a grander plan. That's not what he's doing. But we say things like that, don't we? We try to make ourselves feel better by saying that. We say things like, when God closes a door, he opens a window. Or every dark cloud has a silver lining. You know, I like to classify those things under the term theological dumbfoolery. You know, things that sound really nice, but are actually devoid of all content. Like, if you've ever heard those statements, are they actually comforting? Do they really help? Because it seems to me that it kind of places the blame on the person who is suffering. Because if God closes a door but opens a window and you don't see the window, well, it's your own fault, right? And the suffering that you stay in, well, it's your fault. See, that's kind of the assumption that goes on with those things. See, but in the book of Job, the door just closed. And the dark cloud that surrounded his life was just that. It was a dark cloud. And there wasn't any denying it. But the realization that Job comes to is that he is not alone. The things too wonderful for him to understand was the intricacy of God's presence in the midst of his suffering. Because just like God is present at the birth of a young fawn, just as God knows all the raindrops in an uninhabited land, so too God knows and God is present with Job. So Job says in verse 5, my ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. There's a change in relationship. There's a growing deeper. The first thing that Alicia had heard about me was that I was making beer in my room. In BC, I had a home brew, and I had in my room. Alicia and I, we had many mutual friends. And in fact, Alicia started attending the church that I was a youth worker at the Sunday after I left. And so everybody assumed that we really knew each other. And so they would regale stories of me to Alicia, assuming that she knew exactly what they were talking about. But she didn't meet me at that point. She didn't know me. She just heard all these stories. So she knew that I brewed beer in my room, that I had this and this friend, that I lived in Toronto, that I was unexceptionally awesome. You know, she just heard all this kind of stuff. You know, but then, of course, we met and the relationship changed. You know, she could have said at that point, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. The implication is that Job had heard about God, and he had heard of his ways. Job was a faithful person, but his relationship with God was all through the ritual observance. It was kind of always at an arm's length. But now, in his own life and in his own situation, he has seen God's presence come very close. He has seen and he has felt how God is concerned with and cares for the situation and livelihood that Job is in. Now, again, I want to make this clear. This wasn't the point of his suffering. Okay, this renewed relationship wasn't what it was all about. God didn't cause the suffering so that Job could get to know him more. It was just a product of Job recognizing God's presence with him in the depths of despair. Because after seeing God come so very close, how could he not turn closer to him? And in reality, Job gets the very answer that he was looking for. In all those 37 chapters of screaming and yelling, he gets the answer that he wanted. The final answer that Job receives is not theoretical, and it's not philosophical, it's not even theological as to the purpose or meaning of suffering. The final answer that Job gets is an experience of the God who comes very close in the midst of suffering and despair. And so Job repents. Job turns his life to the God who speaks out of darkness and despair, rather than the God who just shuns himself in comfort and safety. He turns toward the God who does not so shun evil as much as dwell within it. And the epilogue shows Job is beginning his life again. That in his despair, life did not end. That through the grace and through the love and through the blessing of God, Job persevered and Job moved on. We live in a world where there is so much stuff that goes on, doesn't it? It seems like heartache and disaster blares from every corner of the newspaper. And there are global struggles, and there are societal struggles, and then sometimes, probably more often than we would like, those harsh realities of life touch very near, or even afflict our own families, our own friends, or even ourselves. And maybe, I don't know everybody here, but maybe you're in that situation. If you are, I hope that you haven't been let off base by well-meaning but diluted messages. Because whatever situation you find yourself in, it's not divine payback. It's not because you have done something wrong in your life, but because you've done a mistake or sin, and God is just getting back at you. And God has not abandoned you until you shape up and get it right. Your cause is not forgotten. Your suffering is just that. It's suffering. And it's a time that you're going through. And just like Job, you may never, ever get the full details of what's going on or why it happens. But that's okay. Because in the end, that's not really the answer that we look for. What we want is a presence, one to dwell with us in the midst of our dust and ashes, one who will communicate to us endless love and endless care and ultimate redemption. In his book, Where is God When It Hurts?, Philip Yancey writes, "Where is God when it hurts? He has let us cry out and echo Job with louder and harsher fits of anger against him. He has allied himself with the poor and the suffering, establishing a kingdom which is tilted to their favor. He has promised supernatural strength to nourish our spirits, even if our physical suffering goes unrelieved. He has joined us. He has hurt and bled and cried and suffered, and he is with us now." Because the God who shows up to Job in the midst of his agony is the very God who takes that agony upon himself in the torment of the cross. He is the one who goes to the place of thickest darkness and hurt in order to bring about life and grace for all. He is the one who bears the scars in his hands and his feet and his side as evidence to how closely he dwells with our own scars. The final answer to all our questions regarding evil and suffering in this world and in our own lives is not a reason and it's not a rationale, but it's a relationship. It's a presence. And that lesson of Job for us all is one that we can take heart in, that God is here. Thanks be to God.